What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that's both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's video, we're going to be showing another one of the games that we played with the guys from Play to Win over on our Twitch stream, twitch.tv/casuallycompetitivemtg. You should check it out if you like live EDH content. And honestly, there were just so many good games that we got from the stream, we wanted to show you another one. Before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions, we have a few quick channel promotions. The first being, if you want to rep some Casually Competitive merch or pick up one of our playmats, we have a link in the description for both our merch store and our playmat Kickstarter. If you like what we do and want to help support us, we have a Patreon link in the description as well. We really do appreciate everyone who does help us out in this way, and we did just change one of the tiers, so now we'll be releasing for the $5 and up tier a additional gameplay video over on Patreon as a Patreon exclusive. If you're buying cards in the near future, we have a TCG affiliate link in the description. Any purchases you make on TCG Player after clicking on that link will directly help the channel at no cost to you. And finally, if you want to get to know us a little better, we have a Twitter and a Discord. Links are both in the description for that if you want to join our community and just talk with us a little bit. Now, with that all out of the way, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first, we have Cameron from Play to Win, and in this game, he played a deck that is called either Turbo Thrasios or Advantage Thrasios, depending on which deck list you're looking at. And the goal of this deck is to just get insane value off of Thrasios through cards like Zerda, or Training Grounds, or Biomancer's Familiar, or Seedborn Muse, or Kinnan. Just anything to get massive card advantage value off of Thrasios, all while looking for some way to generate infinite mana and then draw the library using Thrasios' ability. Cameron's opening hand contained a Forbidden Orchard, a Scalding Tarn, a Yavimaya Coast, a Nature's Claim, a Soul Ring, a Bloom Tender, and a Deflecting Swat. Going next, we have Bill playing a deck that we have been calling Sad Farm on the stream, which is really just a play off of other decks known as Mad Farm or Bad Farm, but essentially this deck is the commander pairing Tymna and Ikra Shidiqi, and the goal is to get a lot of small valuable creatures to be used as your farm animals to get value off of Tymna, and then utilizing Ikra Shidiqi's life gain ability to get massive value off of something like an Adnaz or a Necropotence, eventually winning the game through a Sickening Dreams Angel's Grace once your library is in your hand off of an Ad Nauseam, or through a Leonin Relic Ward or Animate Dead combo. Bill ended up calling it Sad Farm because it does contain some unoptimal lines, like some Villas lines, to get some value off of losing life with Villas on the battlefield, and just in general, just chooses some suboptimal cards to add, so we call it Sad Farm. It rhymed with the other lists, and we thought it was funny. Anyway, Bill mulliganed down to 6 in this game, and his opening hand contained a Forest, a Command Tower, a Windswept Heath, a Culling the Weak, a Rain of Filth, an Animate Dead, and from the London Mulligan, he bottomed a Snow-Covered Forest. Going third was another one of the guests, Dylan, from Play to Win, and he was playing Najeela of the Blade Blossom. The goal of this list is to generate infinite combat steps using Najeela's ability in combination with something like a Nature's Will or a Derevi. Other lines in this list include a Demonic Consultation, Thassa's Oracle lines, in case Najeela gets shut down a little too hard. Dylan had to mulligan down to 5 cards for this game, and his opening hand contained a Savannah, a Marsh Flats, a Demonic Tutor, a Sylvan Library, an Occam Adversary, and from the London Mulligan, he bottomed a Windswept Heath and an Eldritch Evolution. And finally, going last was Nate, playing again the Ruric Thar list he played in the previous video. Like I said before, the goal of this list is to stacks and smack. You start off by slowing down the board with cards like Thorn of Amethyst, Possibility Storm, anything to prevent your opponents from playing the cards they want to, and eventually dropping Ruric Thar, either slowing down your opponents by not letting them cast non-creature spells, or just by commanding the board from having a very relevant 6/6 Vigilant Beater. The combo line in this deck is a Kiki Jiki Hyrax Tower Scout line in order to close the game out when you do have enough mana. Nate's opening hand contained a Mountain, a Sheltered Thicket, a Carplusian Forest, an Elvish Mystic, a Thorn of Amethyst, a Prowling Serpapod, and a Return of the Wild Speaker. Now with the opening hands and deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Cameron starts this game by drawing, playing a Yavimaya Coast, and tapping it for a colorless to cast a Soul Ring. He then gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Command Tower as his land, and then gives the turn to Dylan. Dylan draws, plays a Savannah as his land for turn, and then taps it for a Fyndhorn Elves. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Nate. Nate draws, plays a Carplusian Forest as his land for turn, and then taps it, taking a damage, to cast an Elvish Mystic. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Cam. Cam untaps and draws, plays a Scalding Tarn, and then taps for 2 mana, taking a damage from his Yavimaya Coast to cast a Bloom Tender. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a forest as his land, and then taps that forest to cast a Deathrite Shaman. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws, plays and cracks his Marsh Flats, paying 1 life to search up a Badlands to the battlefield. He then taps for 3 mana to cast his commander, Najeela of the Blade Blossom. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a mountain as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Thorn of Amethyst. There are no responses to the Thorn, it resolves, and Nate decides to give the turn to Cam. On Nate's end step, Cameron cracks his Scalding Tarn, paying 1 life to search up a Sacred Foundry and has it enter the battlefield tapped. Cam then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Savannah as his land for turn, and then for 2 mana, casts one of his partner commanders, Thrasios Triton Hero. He takes 1 damage from Yavimaya Coast, and then follows this play up by casting his other commander, Akiri Line Slinger. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays and cracks a Polluted Delta, paying 1 life to search up a Godless Shrine, and pays 2 more life to have it enter untapped. He then taps for 3 mana to cast one of his partner commanders, Tymna the Weaver. He then goes to combat and swings his Deathrite Shaman at Nate, who declares no blockers. Nate takes 1 damage, and in Bill's second main phase, Bill takes 1 damage to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws, plays a Taiga as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings Najeela at Nate. On attack, Najeela makes a tapped and attacking 1/1 warrior, tapped and attacking also directed at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, takes the damage, and then in his second main phase, Dylan taps for 2 mana to cast an Oakhame Adversary. With nothing left, Dylan shifts the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a Rootbound Crag as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Prowling Serpapod. The uncounterable Serpapod resolves, and Nate gives the turn to Cameron. Cam untaps, draws, plays a Forbidden Orchard as his land, and then taps for 1 green mana to cast a Sylvan Safekeeper. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Swamp, and then taps his Deathrite Shaman, exiling Dylan's Marsh Flats to help cast his other partner commander, Ikra Shidiqi. With nothing left, Bill gives the turn to Dylan. On his turn, Dylan untaps, draws, and then immediately goes to combat, swinging his entire board at Cameron. On attack, he makes 3 additional 1/1 warriors, also swinging at Cam, and Cam decides to block 2 of the 1/1s, each with a different one of his commanders. He takes 7 damage, his commanders each kill a warrior, and then Dylan draws off of Oakhame Adversary, dealing combat damage to an opponent. In his second main phase, Dylan plays a Volcanic Island as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Demonic Tutor, the extra due to the Thorn of Amethyst. He searches up a card to his hand, and then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then taps for 4 mana to cast a Treasonous Ogre. He then plays a tap Sheltered Thicket as his land for turn, and, with nothing left to do, has to give the turn to Cameron. On Nate's end step, Cameron activates Thrasios by paying 4 mana to scry 1 card to the bottom, and then reveals a Finale of Devastation and draws that card. He then, with his available mana, is able to reactivate Thrasios, and this time scries a card to the top, and then reveals and draws a Pyroblast. Cam then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and then taps for 5 mana to cast a Finale of Devastation X equaling 2, paying the extra mana due to Thorn of Amethyst. It resolves, and he searches up a Biomancer's Familiar to the battlefield. With nothing left, Cam gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Windswept Heath as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings Ikra Shidiqi at Nate and Tymna at Dylan. No blocks are declared. Nate takes 3, Dylan takes 2, and due to both Ikra Shidiqi and Tymna, Bill gains 11 life, and then in his second main phase, he pays 2 to draw 2 cards. He then taps for 4 mana due to the Thorn of Amethyst to cast a Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life into the spell. In response, Cameron pays 2 mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom and then revealing and drawing an Arcane Signet. The Toxic Deluge then resolves and the board is cleared except for Ikra. Bill then pays 1 life to crack his Windswept Teeth to shock in a Temple Garden, paying 2 more life, and then he taps this Temple Garden to pay the additional cost on his Chrome Mox. When the Chrome Mox enters the battlefield, he imprints a Rain of Filth. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws, plays a Forbidden Orchard as his land for turn, and then for 3 mana, casts a Sylvan Library. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Root Maze. There are no responses to Root Maze, and Nate, with no other plays to make, gives the turn to Cameron. Cam untaps, draws, and for 3 mana, casts an Arcane Signet. It enters the battlefield tapped due to Root Maze, and he then taps for 2 mana to cast a Dockside Extortionist. When the Dockside enters the battlefield, Cam gets 4 tapped treasure tokens. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and for 1 green mana, casts a Fin-Torn Elves. He then pays 5 mana to cast Tymna the Weaver for the 2nd time this game. Bill then goes to combat, swings Ikra Shidiqi at Cameron. Cameron declares no blockers, takes 3 damage, and Bill gains 7 life. In his second main phase, Bill pays 1 life to draw 1 card, and then ships the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws 2 extra cards due to his Sylvan Library, and decides to keep 1 additional card, paying 4 life, putting 1 card back on top. In his first main phase, he plays a tapped Bloodstained Mire. He then taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Cam a Spirit to help recast Najeela. With nothing left, Dylan ships the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then pays 2 mana to cast a Wild Growth on his mountain. And unfortunately, with nothing left to do, has to pass the turn over to Cam. Cam untaps, draws, and then taps his Yavimaya Coast for a blue, taking 1 damage to help recast his commander Thrasios. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Twilight Mire as his land for turn, which enters the battlefield tapped due to Root Maze, and then goes to combat and swings Tymna at Nate and Ikra at Dylan. No blockers are declared, they each take the damage, and Bill gains 11 life. In his second main phase, Bill pays 2 life to draw 2 cards off of Tymna, and he then taps for 3 mana to cast a Demonic Tutor. He searches up a card to his hand, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Blood Artist. All through with his turn, he gives the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, and in his upkeep, cracks his Bloodstained Mire to search up a tapped Underground Sea to the battlefield due to Root Maze. He then goes to his draw step, draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library, and pays 8 life to keep all 3 cards. He then for 2 mana, casts a Utopia Sprawl targeting one of his forests, and when it enters the battlefield, he names blue. He then taps the Forbidden Orchard for mana, giving Cameron a Spirit to help cast Derevi. In response to the Derevi cast, Cameron, not wanting this Najeela to get too far off the ground, taps for 2 mana to cast a Pyroblast. The Pyroblast successfully counters Derevi, and Dylan then goes to combat and swings Najeela at Nate, making a 1/1 on attack, and Nate, who declares no blockers, takes a total of 4 damage. With nothing left, Dylan gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then for 1 green mana, casts a Tinderwall. He then immediately sacrifices the Tinderwall for mana to help cast his commander, Ruric Thar the Unbowed. In response to the Ruric Thar cast, Cameron taps his Forbidden Orchard for mana, giving Nate a Spirit, and pays 2 life for the Phyrexian mana to cast a Noxious Revival, targeting his own Biomancer's Familiar. In response to the Noxious Revival cast, Bill taps for 2 mana to cast an Entomb. The Entomb resolves, Bill searches up a Leonin Relic Warder to his graveyard, and then Cameron gets his Biomancer's Familiar back onto the top of his library, and then finally, Ruric Thar resolves, enters the battlefield, and Nate gives the turn to Cameron. On his turn, Cam untaps, draws, and then for 2 mana, casts Biomancer's Familiar. He then goes to combat and swings his Dockside Extortionist at Dylan, who declares no blockers, takes a damage, and then Cam gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then taps for 3 mana to cast an Abrupt Decay targeting Thrasios. On cast, Bill takes 6 damage, and then in response to the cast, Cameron activates Thrasios, scrying a card to the top and then revealing and drawing a Seedborn Muse. He then, with his available mana, taps for 2 to again activate Thrasios, this time scrying a card to the bottom and revealing a Carpet of Flowers. With no further responses, Thrasios is destroyed, and Bill then goes to combat and swings Ikra Shidiqi at Dylan. Dylan declares no blockers, takes 3 damage, Bill gains 7 life, and in his second main phase, he pays 1 life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. He then in his second main phase taps for 3 mana to cast an Animate Dead, targeting the Leonin Relic Warder in his graveyard. A quick note here is he tapped 2 lands and intended to tap the Fyndhorn Elves. He just forgot to actually do it due to what was going on in the stream. This doesn't affect anything, but I wanted to point it out. On cast, he takes 6 damage, and then in response to the Animate Dead cast, Cameron hard casts Deflecting Swap, paying an extra for the Thorn of Amethyst, to change the target of this enchantment aura from Leonin Relic Warder to the Elvish Mystic in Nate's graveyard. On cast, Cameron takes 6 damage, and then the Deflecting Swap resolves. Bill gets a 0/1 Elvish Mystic due to the negative abilities of Animate Dead rather than his win condition, and he then taps for 2 mana to cast a Culling the Weak, sacrificing his Fyndhorn Elves as an additional cost. On cast, he takes 6 damage, and then Culling the Weak resolves, and Bill floats 4 black mana. With 2 of this mana, he casts a Mindblade Render. With the remaining 2, he casts a Sensei's Divining Top, taking 6 damage on cast, and when it enters the battlefield, it should be tapped. However, we did forget to tap it after it entered the battlefield. It does not affect the game in any way. Just wanted to make sure that you guys remembered about the Root Maze because we sure wanted to. With nothing left, Bill passes the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws 2 additional cards from Sylvan Library, and decides it's best to not keep any extra cards and just keeps 1 of them. He then goes to combat and swings his 1/1 warrior at Bill, and on attack, Najeela creates another 1/1, also tapped and attacking Bill. Bill blocks with Tymna, and his Mindblade Render takes no damage, actually gains 2 life from the Tymna lifelink, and with nothing left, Dylan has to pass the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a tapped Mountain as his land for turn due to Root Maze, and then goes to combat and swings Ruric Thar at Bill. Bill blocks Ruric Thar with his Elvish Mystic. The Elvish Mystic dies, and then in Nate's second main phase, he taps for 5 mana to cast a Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. However, with no additional mana up at this point, he has to pass the turn to Cam. Cam untaps, draws, and then taps for 5 mana to cast a Seedborn Muse. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his upkeep activates Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then draws and taps for 1 mana to pay the Thorn of Amethyst tax on a Noxious Revival, paying 2 life for the Phyrexian mana, and then taking 6 damage from Ruric Thar on cast. He targets the Animate Dead, and when Noxious Revival resolves, he puts Animate Dead back on top of his library. He then goes to combat and swings Tymna, Ikra Shidiqi, and the Mindblade Render at Dylan. Dylan declares Najeela as a blocker for the Mindblade Render. Combat damage happens, the Mindblade Render dies, Bill decides to ping Cam with the Blood Artist trigger for 1, Bill gains 1 off of that, and then due to the combat damage that went through from Ikra and from Tymna, Bill gains 11 more life, and then in his second main phase, he pays 1 of this life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. In his second main phase, he recasts his Animate Dead for 3 mana, targeting Leonin Relic Warder in his graveyard. In response to the Animate Dead, Dylan taps for 2 mana to cast a Swords to Plowshares, targeting the Blood Artist. It resolves, the Blood Artist is exiled, and since the Blood Artist was exiled, it never dies, so it deals no damage. The Animate Dead then resolves, Leonin Relic Warder enters the battlefield. He decides to exile Animate Dead with that Enter the Battlefield trigger, which means Leonin Relic Warder goes back into the graveyard, and Animate Dead goes back onto the battlefield. When it re-enters, he decides to not retarget Leonin Relic Warder since he has no payout, and he instead decides to target Nate's Prowling Serpapod. The Animate Dead then enters with Prowling Serpapod, and Bill decides to pass the turn to Dylan. Dylan untaps, draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library, and decides to not keep any extra, just drawing 1 for turn. With no plays to make, he has to pass the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a tapped Forest as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings his 6/6 Ruric Thar at Bill. Bill declares no blockers, takes 6 Ruric Thar damage, and then Nate gives the turn to Cameron. Cam untaps, draws, plays a tapped Stomping Ground as his land for turn, and then for 6 mana, again recasts his commander Thrasios, taking 1 total damage from his lands. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and Cameron also untaps due to the Seedborn Muse. In Bill's upkeep, he pays 1 mana to activate Sensei's Divining Top to reorder the top 3 cards of his library. Bill then draws his card for turn, and for 1 mana, casts a Serra Ascendant. He then goes to combat and swings both of his commanders at Dylan, and Dylan decides to trade his Najeela for Tymna. Dylan takes 3 damage, Bill gains a total of 9 life off of the lifelink and off of Ikra, and then, for 3 mana, he casts a Fabro Elder. With nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Dylan, and in his end step, Cameron decides he wants to play a little bit more Magic, so he taps for 2 mana to activate Thrasios due to the Biomancer's Familiar, to scry 1 card to the bottom, and then reveal and draw a Training Grounds. He again reactivates Thrasios, scrying a card to the top, getting a tapped Breeding Pool to the battlefield, again activates Thrasios to bottom 1 card and reveal and draw a Fabro Elder, and he then taps for 2 more mana, giving Dylan a 1/1 Spirit from the Forbidden Orchard to scry a card to the bottom and then reveal and draw an Isochron Scepter. With nothing left, Dylan finally goes to his turn, untaps, draws 2 additional cards from Sylvan Library, and decides to just keep 1 of them, not taking damage. He plays a tapped Bayou as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast an Edric Spymaster of Trest. The Spymaster resolves, and Dylan goes to his end step to pass the turn to Nate, and in his end step, Nate taps for 6 mana to cast a Return of the Wild Speaker. He takes 6 damage on cast and chooses the mode to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures he controls, so since he has Ruric Thar, he draws 6 cards. Once that is resolved and all set, Cameron decides to, for 2 mana, activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and revealing and drawing a Brainstorm. He activates Thrasios again, scrying to the bottom, and drawing a Sylvan Library. He activates Thrasios again scrying to the bottom, and revealing a Steam Vents, which enters the battlefield tapped. And finally, he activates Thrasios a 4th time to scry to the bottom, and reveal and draw a Cyclonic Rift. With nothing left, Nate goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a tapped Forest as his land for turn, and then for 2 mana, casts a Vexing Shusher. He then for 1 red mana, casts an Orcish Lumberjack. He then goes to combat and swings Ruric Thar at Bill. Bill blocks with his Fabro Elder, takes no damage, and then Nate decides to pass the turn to Cameron, and in Nate's end step, Cameron for 8 mana overloads a Cyclonic Rift. On cast, he takes 6 damage from Ruric Thar, and then in response to the Rift, Bill pays 1 mana to activate his Sensei's Divining Top to reorder the top 3 cards of his library. Once he's all through, Nate, in response to the Cyclonic Rift still, for 1 green mana, casts a Nature's Claim targeting the Animate Dead on Bill's board. On cast, Nate takes 6 damage, and then in response to the Nature's Claim, Cameron taps his Forbidden Orchard for a blue, giving Bill a 1/1 Spirit to again activate Thrasios, scrying 1 card to the bottom, and revealing an Arid Mesa, which enters the battlefield tapped. The Nature's Claim then resolves, Bill gains 4 life, and then all of Cameron's opponent's boards get bounced. With nothing left, Cameron goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Taiga as his land for turn, and then for 1 blue mana, casts a Brainstorm. He then decides to pay 1 life to fetch with his Arid Mesa to get a Plateau to the battlefield. He then for 2 mana, casts a Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. He then takes 1 damage from Yavimaya Coast to generate a blue mana to cast a Training Grounds. He then taps Soul Ring for 3 colorless mana, and decides, since his Thrasios activations only cost 1 colorless at this point, he decides to activate Thrasios a few times. The first time, he bottoms 1 card and reveals and draws a Swords to Plowshares. He again bottoms another card and reveals and draws a Mox Amber. The third time, he bottoms the card again and draws a Dispel. He then casts his Mox Amber for 0 mana and taps it for 2 mana to activate Thrasios 2 more times, bottoming 1, drawing a Dovin's Veto, bottoming another, drawing a Veil of Summer. For these next activations, he's actually using his land, so just keep that in mind. So he does it 1 more time, bottoming a card, revealing and drawing Fellwar Stone. Thrasios is again, this time keeping Mox Diamond on the top and drawing that card, and he then activates Thrasios for a final time, scrying a card to the bottom and revealing and drawing a Basalt Monolith. He then decides to cast this Basalt Monolith, and taps this Basalt Monolith for 4 colorless mana. He then pays 3 of this mana back into Basalt Monolith's ability to untap it, and in response to that activation, Dylan taps his mana to cast an Abrupt Decay targeting the Monolith. In response to the Abrupt Decay, Cameron casts Veil of Summer for 1 green mana, giving Dylan a 1/1 Spirit from the Forbidden Orchard being tapped for mana. In response to the Veil of Summer, Dylan gives Nate a 1/1 Spirit from his Forbidden Orchard to cast a Flusterstorm, attempting to counter the Veil with 7 total copies, all coming at Veil of Summer. Cameron is not able to pay, the Veil of Summer is countered, and the Basalt Monolith is then destroyed. Cameron decides to then go to his end step, discards quite a few cards down to hand size, and then Bill goes to his turn. Bill untaps, draws, and really just out of gas after being stopped from multiple wins, has to go to pass the turn to Dylan. In Bill's end step, Cameron decides he really wants to play a lot of Magic today, so he activates Thrasios a total of 16 times. Off of these activations, he gets 7 lands to the battlefield tapped, as well as a Neoform, a Sensei's Divining Top, a Mox Opal, a Flusterstorm, a Silence, a Pact of Negation, a Dramatic Reversal, a Force of Vigor, and a Mana Crypt. Finally, all through with the Thrasios shenanigans, Dylan gets to go to his turn. Dylan untaps, draws, plays a tapped Overgrown Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to recast Edric, Spymaster of Trest. With nothing left, Dylan goes to pass the turn to Nate, and Cameron, deciding that he has all of the pieces he needs, decides to not activate Thrasios at this time, and Nate gets to go to his turn. Nate untaps, draws, and decides to just replay some of his mana dorks, so he replays his Fintorn Elves, his Orcish Lumberjack, and his Wild Growth. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Cameron. Cameron untaps, draws, and for 0 mana, casts a Mox Opal. He then casts a Mana Crypt. He then for 2 mana, casts an Isochron Scepter. In response to the Isochron, Bill taps for 5 mana to cast an Ad Nauseam. In response to the Ad Nauseam, Cameron taps for 1 white mana to cast a Silence. The Silence resolves, and Bill decides that going deep with Ad Nauseam really doesn't mean much if he can't cast anything, so he goes 1 card deep, takes 2 life off of a Zulaport Cutthroat, and then the Ad Nauseam finishes resolving, and Isochron Scepter resolves. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints a Dramatic Reversal. He's then able to generate infinite mana and draw the rest of his library. He's then able to play something like an Underworld Breach to get access to not only his library, but his graveyard as well, play all of his mana dorks, and then recast a Finale of Devastation pumped up as big as he wants, and then swing out, winning through combat damage. Out of the 4 games we played on stream, this one was honestly my favorite because I just love this Advantage Thrasios or Turbo Thrasios deck. It's a lot of fun to play. I've had it built for quite a while and I've been playing it for the past few weeks, and I've had such a good time with this, so it's really nice to see it pop off, it to do well, and I'm glad we're able to showcase it on the video because it really is such a cool deck. The introduction of cards like Zerda and like Kinnan really bring this deck together to give you another copy of Training Grounds that also copies with cards like Basalt Monolith, or Kinnan, which also combos with Basalt Monolith, and just with a lot of redundancy and value in the deck. It's honestly such a fun deck to play. It might not be as fun for your opponents when you're Thrasiosing 15 times on their end step, but if you're the one playing Thrasios, once you get that Seedborn Muse or Biomancer's Familiar or Training Grounds on the battlefield, it's just so fun to always keep your hand full, always be able to do something with your mana. It's just a really good value-based deck, and overall, I love this deck personally, so I'm sorry if I seem a bit biased here. But let's talk about a card of the game really quick, and honestly, I'm not going to give it to Thrasios because that's just way too obvious. That card is super overpowered. I'm going to give it to Biomancer's Familiar and Seedborn Muse as kind of co-MVPs for this game because they both enabled a card like Thrasios to be so oppressive and so strong. The Training Grounds was also nice, later in the game getting the 1 mana Thrasios activations, but the Biomancer's Familiar and the Seedborn Muse really just was able to get him to where he needed to be the turn or 2 before he won, so those are going to have to be the most valuable cards, but they just did insane work in this game to really showcase how strong Thrasios can really be in the right shell, because I know you guys were thinking Thrasios wasn't good enough already, but in a deck like this, it really does show how good of a card Thrasios can really be. Overall, as a bit of a recap, I did personally think that this was a really well-balanced game. There was a lot of back and forth in the early to mid game, with the Sad Farm deck almost going off with Leon and Relic Warder, with Najeela ready to go off after Demonic tutoring a Revi. There were just a lot of things in this game that was just really back and forth. The stacks pieces from Ruric Thar were not irrelevant. The root maze making fetch lands not only enter tapped, but also fetch up tapped lands. That was incredibly relevant. The Thorn of Amethyst also did a lot of work to slow down people. So just overall in this game as a whole, I felt like this was a really fun game to watch. If you do like watching these games, be sure to check out our Twitch channel where we stream pretty much all of the games we're playing while we're kind of quarantined, and we believe we're going to continue doing this moving forward. I think we're going to start streaming our in-person recording days. So even after the quarantine ends, we will still be streaming at least twice a week. And also, if you want to check out Play to Win, be sure to check out their channel, link in the description. They make some really quality cEDH based content, and I highly suggest it. But that is all we have for this video. We hope you enjoyed it. Again, my name is Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG. We will see you next time.